Hello, San Francisco. Are we? Hi, San Francisco. Here in New York, we're still wrapping up our break. If folks want to make their way back to the front and back to the seats, I'm really excited for the next panel conversation that's taking place. It's going to be moderated by Justin Hendricks, the founder and editor of Tech Policy Press. And you don't want to miss this conversation that he's going to be discussing, which is going to be looking at big questions in emerging tech. So hopefully everybody in San Francisco has had their speed lunch and is back in their seats. And I'm going to ask the same for our New York gang, who are still very busy socializing. So if folks could come back to their seat, we will turn to Justin, who's on standby, to moderate this really amazing conversation that we're really looking forward to having. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, hopefully you all can hear me well enough, and I see that my panelists are now joining as well. So very grateful to the organizers, and Lyle, thank you so much for inviting me to do this, and a lot of great organizations involved in this event. I've had the opportunity to work with several of them, including Omidyar, of course, BetaWorks, the folks at New Lab, many others. So thank you all so much for doing this, and I hope on both coasts everyone is feeling good and ready for a conversation around big questions in emerging tech. So the brief that I've been given is to think about a little bit of putting together in this conversation someone who comes at the world perhaps primarily as an investor, a builder of tech firms and a deployer of capital, and someone who comes at it primarily as a public intellectual and someone who has contributed to the intellectual discourse around technology and society in very substantial ways. So we've got two forms of influence here, two forms of thinking and ways of looking at the tech world and the intersection of tech and society. And hopefully we can find some commonalities and perhaps where their ideas diverge. So just to quickly introduce my panelists. We've got Dr. Sophia Noble, who is a MacArthur Fellow, director of the UCLA Center on Race and Digital Justice, and you may know her as author of the book Algorithms of Oppression, which is always assigned to my students in the Tech, Media, and Democracy course that I teach at NYU. And then we've got Bilal Jubeiri, who is a general partner at Lux Capital. He is working with startups that he says, solve big practical problems with technically ambitious solutions. We'll hear a little bit more about that, and has investments in industries across enterprise software, deep tech, healthcare, and works with companies at all stages, from the seed stage, so companies not unlike the ones that may emerge at BetaWorks, on through to much larger ones. So just by way of kind of getting started, I'm going to ask you both just a kind of opening question, really about sort of where we are at the moment in this conversation around the intersection of tech and society. We're kind of, 5-6 years now into what some have termed the tech lash. What do you make of this conversation? Is it a healthy one at the moment? Have we made some progress? Sophia, perhaps I'll start with you.
Thanks so much, Justin. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and to be in this conversation with you. And Bilal, and thank you to the organizers as well, and big fans. And I think you're right that we are into, we're well into the tech lash, although you might argue that COVID-19 and sending a lot of middle class, white collar workers to work from home re-energized the tech industry. In fact, one of the things we saw that was truly a profound crisis, I think, was that during the pandemic, which is still ongoing, by the way, we saw many people out of work. We saw the crisis and the failures of our public infrastructure, namely public health infrastructure, our lack of that in the United States. And we saw the tech industry make money hand over fist. So that tells us a lot about this relationship between technology, the tech industry, and society, that in some way creates certain affordances for some strata of society, but also has profound consequences. And of course, I was thinking and writing about this during the pandemic too, because we saw here in California, a huge crisis around lack of healthcare, essential workers, and people not being able to survive, mass evictions nationwide, internationally even. And here we are at, just in the heart of Silicon Valley, Silicon Beach, and California, if any state in the country, should have fared very well. But in fact, what we see is that the relationship between the tech sector and society is one where the sector really, it neglects its responsibility to contribute to the building of society. And I say that, in a way, as a person who is a technophile, who uses all the technologies. But when, the sector opts out of caring for workers, paying taxes, which really support that kind of public infrastructure and educational infrastructure. We had in LA, for example, tens of thousands of students who were pushed out of the educational system just by lack of access to technology. So we have a very uneven relationship in this society to technology and to the tech sector. Many winners, many more losers, I think, when you think about what the impact the sector has had on all of us. And that, to me, is a very important conversation that we finally get to have. A decade ago, when women, in particular, and people of color, were talking about the harmful effects of the industry and different products in our communities, if no one was interested in listening to that. And now these conversations about harm, about ethics, about morality, and the sector and the products are in the mainstream. So I think that's incredible progress. So that, as you know, Justin, as an educator, we can't solve problems that we can't talk about. So I'm glad we're talking about it, and I'm glad to be in this conversation about it.
Bilal, I want to bring you in. You have been, I don't want to say rare, but perhaps among the few investors who is willing to kind of engage with this aspect of the conversation. From your perspective, and maybe thinking about other folks who's maybe run in your same circle, where do you think we are? Is it, are we seeing a backlash to the backlash on some level? Do you feel that in Silicon Valley these days?
Thank you for inviting me for this conversation. Couple of thoughts here. One, internet entered our lives about 25 or so years ago, maybe 30 years ago at most. And while it has generated tremendous wealth for a lot of people, and a lot of wealth for some people, and it has generated a lot of change in society, if you really think about it, only a few industries have really been dramatically impacted. So the two industries that come to my mind are communications and commerce, right? We email each other, we talking to each other using these modern tools. Newspaper publishing has gone online and in fact decentralized and distributed in some ways, and commerce, we get boxes delivered to our home with stuff that we sometimes buy on the whim. But a majority of other sectors of the economy actually were not significantly affected by this advent of technology. We sort of, 20, 30 years later, do you go online to buy your cars? Very few people do. Are the cars built any differently? Very few people would say that. Same thing for construction industry and medical industry and so on. So there are two things going on in regards to this backlash. Number one, over the last 5-10 years, there's been this tech versus media debate that has come up, right? And people think that this started off somewhere around 2015 or so when media somehow decided that technology was responsible for bringing, Trump in power. And they were already upset that, you had destroyed the freedom of press, or you had taken away the power of the press. And they were probably justified in doing that. So I'm not defending them, but I think there's been this narrative in Silicon Valley that that they're out to bring us down a notch in our reach and or our influence. But more important thing that's happening in the technology industry. So that's there, and we can talk about that. More important thing that's happening in the industry over the last 5 to 10 years is that technology has now started to really sort of enter every aspect of our lives. When I think about what I invest in, and $4 billion fund investing across technology industries, we say we invest at the intersection of technology and sciences. This could be biological sciences, so you have healthcare, life sciences, digital health, and all of that. You have physical sciences, from semiconductor technology to autonomy, automation, advanced manufacturing. And then you have computer sciences, which is blockchain and decentralized web, and then you have cybersecurity and so on. And in all of those segments, if you really think about it, ethics and transparency has a much more important role to play than it would have even in communication. Not that communication and media is not important, and having ethics and transparency is very important there. But when we're talking about biases introduced into the system systematically when you're developing drugs, or when you're using advanced AI systems for targeting weapons, right? Or when you're using that to figure out, cars driving on the road and the disasters that can happen. I think technology industry broadly, now, when I say broadly, I mean more than just the technology industry that's working on Snapchat, Facebook, Google. Technology industry broadly is starting to think about responsibility and ethics a little bit more carefully, and starting to figure out how do we introduce that early into our design cycles. So when we're doing genetic engineering and stuff related to biological sciences, we have to think about ethics early. It is not an afterthought. When we're thinking about autonomous systems that are driving our vehicles, but also driving tanks in the battlefields, we have to think about these things early on. And I think there is a need for a better communication to happen with the rest of the society that is more advanced in these things, but has thought about this a lot more from theoretical and practical perspectives, because this is now affecting every part of our lives. In some ways, the food that we eat is affected by what's happening on the back end with some of the advanced technological developments. So I think Silicon Valley, and I mean, when I say Silicon Valley, I mean the tech industry broadly, not the geography, is starting to pay attention to that a little bit more. But I think we need a lot more voices, because it's no longer just a bunch of kids eating pizza, writing some dating website, and making a lot of money. This is actually influencing our everyday lives. There are people who are taking leadership roles when talking about it. And by that, I mean not people like me who are yapping away, but really CEOs who are making everyday decisions based on that. They're not getting enough time and attention. And I don't think they're getting enough support. And it's really important that they're provided with the tools that are required for them to be able to make the right decisions. We will never 100% probably agree. The country is polarized and divided in many different ways. So this will be probably no different. But certainly there's a real incentive and a real process in place to sort of figure out how do we do this better, especially not to repeat the mistakes that were made in the past.
Sophia, maybe I'll just bring you in on one thing that Bilal said, that some of these ideas, frameworks, rubrics around ethical tech, ethical AI, the rest of that, we're awash in those. I read a paper recently that explored over 80 different ethical AI frameworks that had been put out by either industry groups or, different think tanks that sort of working on that problem. Do you think we're close to kind of, seeing those frameworks widely enough deployed or understood, or perhaps even put to use in industry to make a difference? Or do we need to think about it differently?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting moment where these conversations about ethics have, in some ways, subverted or been captured. You could argue them different ways. Um, they've subverted our ability to talk about justice in society and fairness and equity, which really, if you look at the kind of early feminist scholars and kind of critical scholars of technology, their emphasis was on issues of justice in society. And so you could even just look at, and Bilal, I love that you were mentioning all of the different sciences that your company invests in. And I was waiting to hear social science, and I didn't hear that. But that is, I'm a social scientist, so obviously I think about the ways in which technology gets designed for society by people who know absolutely nothing about society. And so I think that is very important if we talk about sites of expertise that would then foreground these issues of justice and equity, which is quite different than thinking about the randomization of harm, which also happens in some of these kinds of AI and ethics conversations, which is like, well, we know there will be harm. How do we randomly distribute it instead of concentrating it among Black people or poor people or women or the disabled, right? And so that that's a completely different set of outcomes, in fact, that you would get if you took those types of models, or if you reached back to, some fantasy or mythology about the universal human and thought about, universal applications. And of course, this is one of the things that I really try to tear into in my book, Algorithms of Oppression, is to say, like, there is no universal human. And when we think about universal design in that way, which I know because I took all the HCI courses and I worked in UX and I, really worked with programmers for years. And, that is always about like an imagined user or an imagined application or an imagined problem that is simple and not complex in the way that we know as social scientists these applications will actually unfold. And unfortunately, the reason we're having so many of these conversations is because of the tremendous amounting of harm. I mean, every week there's a new story about harm or degradation that has happened by a company or by a product. And so I think this is incredibly important. And even if it were a matter of where does the largesse of the profit for the kinds of products that I would say get kind of experimented upon society. I mean, in the pharmaceutical context, the example that you gave, I mean, I always think about that we would never let some guys whip up some chemicals, batch some chemicals up, and then on the weekend we roll it out to millions of people, hundreds of millions of people globally, and then we say, like, when it fails or it harms people, we say, like, oops, well, it's just chemistry. We would never do that, but of course that's what we do in the tech industry. We say, well, it's just software, it's just math, and that's of course incredibly disingenuous. I mean, what we should also be thinking about is when the profits from all of this experimentation happen in society, how is that reinvested back into creating better conditions for people to live in, to engage with those products? Because right now, to me, what we have is what feels like a race to the bottom. I mean, we have the rich getting richer. We have the UK House of Lords study from a couple of years ago that said by 2030, that 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth. We see massive global economic inequality. And we would be fooling ourselves if we didn't think that the tech sector was implicated in that. 7 of the 10 most well-capitalized companies in the world on planet Earth are tech companies. So the question is, what is it about the model of extraction and profit, kind of at all costs, that creates more social problems, quite frankly? What is the sector's role and responsibility in engaging with social scientists and humanists and others, artists, to imagine different kinds of solutions that are also invested in? And I think this is where, there will, I say this to my students all the time. I say, like, what do they want? Like, that in 10 years, all we do is watch videos of other people eating food. and then my students are like, I do that, and then I'm lost, But I mean, this is the notion that justice, these issues of justice in society, really need to be more tightly tethered to these conversations about ethics, equity, power. And I think we're just, this conversation, I have to say, it's the first time I've been in a conversation with a venture capitalist where you hold all the resources, and this is also part of the dynamic, is that very, very wealthy people get to decide, and the rest of us kind of have to attend to trying to solve the problems. And I think, and that's not specific, Bilal, to you, but it really is like, that's the dynamic. And that seems like a really grotesque dynamic too, that we're going to have to contend with in all of this.
Bilal, do you recognize that dynamic? Do you try to find ways to challenge it in your work?
Well, so I mean, there was really only one statement that, Sophia, you just said that I disagree with quite a bit, which is, this idea of extraction of profits at all costs. That is that may be true for some people, that may be true for some organizations, but I don't think technology industry works that way. I don't think technology founders and entrepreneurs work that way. Technology entrepreneurs look like me, an immigrant who came into the country with $300 in his pocket and saying, I need to, I have all this intellect and I have all this knowledge and this country has paid for my education. Let me go solve problems, and starts a business to solve a particular problem, happened to be in advanced materials for environmental pollution control. And I build that company and sell that company. And then I say, how can I help other people do the same thing? And I become a VC. And the day I become a VC, do I get a title slapped on me that, vulture capitalist and extracting profits at all costs? I think on average, if you look at, and again, I think that, and I'm not suggesting you're doing that, but the demonization that happens of the tech industry is that, every founder is out there trying to make more and more money. Again, probably true for some people, but the founder who started a biotech business or the founder who started an autonomous car business, they probably spent 5 to 20 years of their lives doing nothing but technological development in labs. They were like, lab rats working at close to minimum pay, trying to develop something new to happen, right? And then they figured out, oh, I can actually make this work. I can, maybe I cannot drive a car on the road, but I can have it on a sidewalk, deliver robots. And, oh, that's interesting. And then I can put some LiDARs on it and they can do the delivery and it'll be cheaper. But if the headline they get is this is taking jobs away from the pizza delivery guys, that's demoralizing, right? And I'm not sure how that's extracting profit. They have to have profitable businesses so they can be, frankly, they can fund universities that other people are working at, right? Like they can fund medical institutions. Like the money I get, all LPs are medical colleges, universities, nonprofits, foundations, endowments, and so on. So there's I think, where the tech industry has gone wrong is, as you rightly stated, that we haven't quite figured out how to connect with the community that we actually serve in a meaningful way, that they're not just customers, but, when we say they're stakeholders, what does that mean and who represents them, right? Are they represented by, social scientists and people who are experts in, in the academic background in those areas? Do we bring them in directly? Is there a more case of how do we create a distributed governance issue, decision-making issue? Is this a corporate philanthropy problem, meaning the profits need to be, some amount of profits need to be redistributed back or reinvested? I don't think tech industry has figured that out. And by tech, again, I don't mean just the IT tech. I mean the tech industry broadly. The way to think about this, you mentioned we don't give drugs willy-nilly. I mean, yes, that is true, but I also think that we saved a lot of lives when we bypassed some of the FDA processes to say we need to get vaccines into the market sooner through essentially waivers, right? Like I got shot multiple times with vaccines through waivers. And I was taking the risk that something could go wrong, and thankfully it didn't. In fact, there's entirely a reason to believe that we have to figure out how to bring more technology into this space. Use AI to do clinical trials better, so that we don't require as many patients in as much time. So there's work to be done here. Where technology industry is not understanding and certainly not hearing is what is the right way to constructively engage, so that our practices can be better environmentally, ethically, and transparency bias, etc. wise.
Yeah,
Well,
I want to.
oh, go ahead, Sophia. I was
I
gonna.
just, yeah, I want to just, respond because I think, we're not talking about individuals entirely. We're also talking about systems and structures. So we can't deny, for example, the role the tech industry has played, especially the largest ones in the social media platforms and search, have played in weakening democracy in liberal democracies around the world. I mean, I think that's pretty well undisputed. And by weakening those democratic institutions that we have that are flawed and are not perfect, we also weakened our ability to respond to the distribution of the vaccine, for example, and the distrust in science, which, of course, as a professor, is leaves me slackjawed because, of course, science is so incredibly important in our society. So, on one hand, we think we've done one thing by participating in an acceleration of solutions, but we've also structurally weakened the whole operation, right? The democratic structures that hold up our society, and that includes universities and public education and healthcare and public media. I mean, these are so important. Public libraries. I will say, as a person who works in a university, that the cherry picking, for example, of which projects to support that are in the interest, right, of particular industries weakens those institutions too. I mean, you walk on any college campus and go to the med school or go to the engineering school and see how gorgeous and beautiful and modern it is, and then take a walk over to my neighborhood where the humanists and the social scientists hang out, and our buildings are almost close to being condemned. So I think we have to be honest about this if we're going to talk about the role that industry is playing in shifting structures that then weaken the safety net we need for the most vulnerable among us. That is just like, we have to be honest about that. And if we put our focus there and our resources there, we'd actually have a very different set of possibilities. And I will just say, I raise money for, my center at UCLA and for my work. And it's very hard. Whenever I say we need money to strengthen Black women's power, guess what? Crickets. No one's interested in that. Nobody wants to fund that. But when you look out and you see who shows up at the polls, who's organizing workers, who's trying to save democracy, Black women at the forefront. So these contradictions are how, I want to talk about them because I think the status quo way of how philanthropy and corporate investment and so forth has been going into our institutions, it's a sleight of hand kind of situation here. And I just want to make sure we talk about that honestly and systematically and not just about what individuals do.
Absolutely. And I want to raise maybe a question for both of you about perhaps something that may bridge both your concerns, which is, typically we might look to government to perhaps provide some frameworks, rules that would rationalize this conversation or provide some guardrails to sort of both sides of it. But in the United States, we haven't made much progress on regulation. We haven't, seen any substantial laws passed that would, change this situation in the last few years. And when I talk to people from around the world who have similar concerns as yours, Sophia, they say to me, can't you do something, to sort of change this dynamic? And they expect the U.S. government perhaps would have to act. We're seeing, of course, in the European Union, them take a much more sort of substantial role in regulating tech, both with the Digital Services Act, the AI Act that's now kind of in close to final form. What do you make of that problem? And Bilal, perhaps I'll start with you on that one.
So my view, yes, government has an important role to play. I also believe technology industry is moving so fast that a lot of the people who participate in government are just scrambling to even understand, let alone react to it. Now, you can have a, emotional reaction and pass laws. In my opinion, part of what happened with GDPR is now a cluster, right? Like I'm not sure how much privacy they were able to preserve, but they were able to inflict a significant cost to their consumers. But that's aside. That does not mean that there shouldn't be a GDPR. But it was done so in such haste and by people who didn't really fully understand what it means when everybody's consuming everything online and small screens, and third of the page is taken up by GDPR approvals. What does that mean for consumer engagement? Anyways, but this so 100% true that we need to have proper government engagement and civic engagement on this. One of the things that has happened is the tech industry over the last 10, 15, 20 years has gone from a small cottage industry to now present in everybody's homes and everybody's pockets and everybody's ears and everybody's hands, right? Like, it's the half-life of technology we talk about. It is getting closer and closer. We used to go inside a computer 50 years ago and work. The computer is now sitting inside us and working, and that has happened in the last 50 years, right? During that time, as this is happening, the influence of technology, broadly speaking, has become global. But the leadership that Silicon Valley and technology has become what I call geofenced, right? One of my friends came up with this idea that we haven't really grown into the kind of leadership that is, by that I mean Silicon Valley individuals haven't taken that leadership role and learned how to be leaders at a global scale. Like, think of Zuckerberg, think of Elon Musk, think, you can go down the list. They have global influence, but many of them don't even travel outside the US unless it's just for a business meetings. Many of them have very limited connectivity to the outside world. They can't speak the way ordinary people want to hear them speak, right? They're like nervous and fidgety and and only a few people have been able to transcend that, right? I mean, the example that comes to my mind is Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs understood what his mission was for the rest of the world. You go back and listen to his speeches from before, and they're poetic. They're poetic to people who are sitting in Pakistan, where I come from, because they think about, what can the world be, and imagine what the world could be with technology. That is not happening today. And I think this is a failure of the technology industry leadership, of not realizing that if you're going to have a global business and a global impact, and at that scale, whereas Sophia was saying that, we can cause significant damage to democratic institutions and other institutions, then you have to have that leadership role, or you have to attract people to your companies that have and empower them to have that leadership role at a bigger stage. Otherwise, we're talking past each other.
Sophia, maybe can I just direct you maybe back even to the original question? How do we connect the harms that you've recognized in your research to potentially government intervention? And do you think that would, on some level, maybe help to relieve the moral burden on industry that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this, because there's no doubt that the kinds of laws we pass in society over-determine what is possible and create the conditions for many different kinds of possibilities. And so we can look at the Civil Rights Act, for example. We can look at laws that were passed right after the Civil War in 1865 that created the largest enfranchisement, quite frankly, of African Americans into government and leadership roles in the history of this country. And that, without proper legal protections, actually created the greatest backlash in terms of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the Night Riders and the kind of reign of terror that forced Black people into complete oppression post-Civil War. And so the laws that are passed, and I put that I put this conversation in that context to say, when you're born and when you have the opportunity to lead or imagine the kind of society or organizations you want to run, they're generated by the conditions legally of what can flourish and what cannot, and where there are protections and where there are not. And so this is, of course, a moment that is so important, because Bilal is right. I mean, our government, we don't want every single idea to have to go through a vetting process necessarily. But we also we cannot let the whims of, let's say, people who are profoundly immature and who get all the money, quite frankly, and time and space to bring their ideas. I mean, in my family and in my community, we don't say, like, drop out of college and that means you're going to become a billionaire. That's not really the logic that prevails. And yet we have great men of tech narratives that really don't signal genius. They signal the incredible disparity around who gets funded and who gets supported and who doesn't. there are many, many people with vision who could bring great ideas around these conversations about regulation into existence in the Federal Trade Commission, in Congress, at local levels in terms of local regulation. We see this in places like Detroit and San Francisco around pushing back on facial recognition software, for example. But those people with vision and leadership are in the streets. They're grassroots organizations. They are people under-resourced who are pressing on these systems for accountability. They're not necessarily the people who are in leadership that are funded in companies or in leadership who are funded to go into government. And I think those are the kinds of vulnerabilities that we're dealing with in the landscape. I do think that civil society, if you will, making greater investments there would actually strengthen our ability to have more regulatory accountability. But right now, that part of society is profoundly weakened. And I would just say that even the laws that allow for us to have something like billionaires. I mean, I can't agree more with our members of Congress who say that maybe billionaires is a public policy failure when we have so many people without. And so, how much money does one need? Does one company or does one organization or one group of people to be successful for your generations, for your community, right? And then what's possible if we invested those things in other places? Well, it's also the regulatory and public policy framework around how much can be accrued and hoarded and not reinvested back into society. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities in a lot of different ways that are beyond just the specifics of like regulating specific technologies.
And we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm seeing some, comments and questions sort of in the chat here. There's, some sort of sense that is there some way to sort of blend this thinking, particularly earlier on for engineering students in particular, to give them more of a grounding in humanities and ethics. I think we'd all three of us would agree that would be great. Perhaps I know I work on doing that in an engineering school. And Bilal, I think that, you try to kind of bring some of that thinking into your work. But I want to maybe, before the organizers get mad at me and I don't bring up emerging tech at all, I want to talk a little bit about just the next decade of tech development. Bilal, you mentioned, of course, that there are a variety of technologies that are going to impact us, that are going to invade other parts of the economy in different ways and kind of change things, perhaps as radically as we've seen the information ecosystem change over the last 10 or 20 years. Let's just talk about those for a moment. And we only have a couple of minutes for each of you, but what technologies do you in particular feel are going to be sort of most challenging for the economy and for society to contend with? And Sophia, from your perspective, I'd love to hear the answer as well.
My number one worry that keeps me up at night are predictive analytics, predicting people into opportunity and out of opportunity, using data that's captured at one moment in someone's life and having that overdetermine what will be possible for the rest of their lives. I think these the application of predictive analytics might be incredible, in fact, for predicting when an earthquake might hit here in California. And I'd be so grateful and am grateful for the people who work on that kind of technology. But I think when we start putting some of these kinds of models into the human experience, we really deny the agency and the possibility. And Bilal, I think you and I have a lot in common in terms of like our origin stories of coming from nothing and, really trying to work hard into some type of different life experience for our families. And imagine if, the statistical modeling of what happens to poor people and how they fare overdetermined what was possible for us. And, so those kinds of things are absolutely, and you can think about that implied in so many areas: education, health, housing, employment. Those things keep me up at night.
Absolutely. And government, of course, another big role there where government systems adopt these technologies. Bilal, from your perspective?
So I actually would take what Sophia was saying, and I was thinking exactly the same thing. slightly bit broader in the sense of, because coming from a technology field, I think what's happening in this world is that we have sensorized everywhere, and probably more coming, right? I came to this country, I had like one camera in a family. Then it was one camera when I was in college, one camera per person. Now I have like maybe 5 cameras looking at me as I'm talking to you, right? And think about hundreds of cameras everywhere. And when Safiya then talks about, facial recognition and all that stuff, it has to be taken that into context. You may not facial recognize me, but you know everything about me if you have 18 different frequencies shining at me and looking at everything I do. Okay, so now you can use that to figure out if I'm about to get a heart attack, but you can also figure out if you want to have some perverse incentives to know more about my life than I'd like you to know. But we have sensorized everything, and now you take it, that sensors network generates tons of data. Previously, we had humans analyzing that data, so maybe there was a human, control over it to some extent, but now it's too much for humans. So we created machine learning AI, and now we analyze that information. Either we use that for analytics, as Safiya was saying, predictive analytics and insights. What is Justin going to potentially want to eat after this conversation is over? But it can also, you can just create a closed loop on it, and you create automation. And that's autonomous cars and autonomous drones and all of that stuff, right? So this is happening in our world because it's happening in little parts, but it's all coming together. I believe that there's a lot of power in that, obviously earthquakes, but also drug discovery and personalized medicine and all kinds of stuff that becomes relevant. One thing I'd say that's really required here is there's a crisis of leadership. And the crisis of leadership is that people who are leaders in the technology industry do not necessarily see a lot of things that Safiya was talking about and takes leadership as their problem. Right? It's like somebody else's problem. Maybe we should donate a little bit of money to it. I don't know if it should be 5% of my earnings or 50% of my earnings. I don't know, but maybe I should donate a little bit of money on it, right? Effective altruism and all that stuff. But it's all like earn here and give there, but that's not my problem. But similarly, I see the same crisis of leadership on the other side, which is, yeah, sure, we need to figure out how to solve all the problems Safiya was talking about. But how is Safiya, and I don't point at you, but people, who are in that field, how do they become leaders also of, building technology companies that are also profitable, but they're also creating new drugs and creating new communication paradigms and so on and so forth. How do we make that happen? This is not us versus them. The more we make it us versus them, we are doomed because we are also at an international crisis situation versus our competitors, right? Like, our biggest fear right now with our kids is likely not an American company, but a Chinese-based company called TikTok, right? And it designed and engineered to manipulate, conversations in the US. So how do we deal with that? And I personally feel that the more technology becomes sophisticated, the more important it becomes for people to be educated about it, but also understand what all are we trying to do and then work on a similar platform versus sort of shouting from the two sides, like my prince, my church, my church, my warrior, and this is the battlefield. And we have to figure out how we bring it together. And there's room to do that now, because as the economy goes through a recession, as there is a little bit of a tech lash, but there's also jobs being lost across all industries, this is a good time to say, hey, let's talk about how to, this is going to be rebuilt. It's like 2001, it's going to be rebuilt. And the next generation Facebooks and Googles are going to emerge in the next 5-7 years. How do we do that right? We don't want to stop them from emerging. We want to create great companies and great technologies that affect society positively, but let's do it the right way so we don't make the mistakes that we have made in the past.
And I think we're just about out of time. So I think I'll just ask you both. Bilal, do you have Safiya over to your next general partner meeting? And Safiya, would you invite Bilal to your next faculty meeting at the center?
Listen, Bilal, I mean, when you're all trying to figure out what to invest in, I have plenty of people and things and great ideas. I mean, I will just say one thing that is, meaningful is that we are trying to do that, bring together these conversations around data science, engineering, computer science, justice, society. We're trying to do that at UCLA and create a little bit of an outlier. I hate to use these like Silicon Valley words like North Star, but I think that that's language that's recognizable probably in this group, so that we can model how to do and have these conversations that have the impact that you're talking about for the next 10 years. And I welcome anyone from this meeting who would want to invest in those conversations substantially. Because guess what? We're up against people like me, we're up against people who have hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal to, trick off, to be quite honest, while the rest of us are really, scrambling for the crumbs. And so I think if we're going to be serious, there's no shortage of great people and great ideas to invest in. And there has to be like some openness and some willing to do that. So I'm ready to come to the meeting, Bilal. But of course, everyone here is also welcome to reach out to me and see where there are possibilities, because we need new possibilities.
I'm in the business of zigging when others are zagging, or vice versa. So absolutely, and I'm always looking for people who have an outside opinion, because average startup fails, average VC doesn't return the capital they've spent. So that's the industry I operate in, with which you need to be outside what everybody else is thinking. And I think this is an opportunity to fund founders who don't look like what founders have typically looked like. We're not building in industries where others have built before. And this is an iterative problem, right? This is not going to be solved because some grand, legislation is going to come down and solve all our problems. This is no different than the TV problems or media problems or journalism problems. I mean, this is going to continue to happen in new and more exciting ways. And we need to be in continuous communication to do that. Everybody who's involved in this, including the founders, including the VCs and others, but also importantly, the society that they're going to impact, and they have to figure out how to do that. A/B testing is not enough.
Well, that's certainly also what I believe at Tech Policy Press, trying to cover that intersection of tech and society, tech and democracy. I think it will be, a species challenge for forevermore.
Right.
So hopefully we'll carry on with that. Thank you so much, Dr. Safiya Noble, Bilal Jubairi. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will turn it back over, I believe, to John.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. What an interesting, fascinating note to leave on, and especially Election Day week, pointing out tech and democracy. Thank you, Safiya. Thank you, Bilal. Thank you, Justin, so much. All right. I'm going to